Good morning. Thank you for all of you who are here with us in person and for those of you who are here with us online. It is my difficult task this morning to provide an overview of refugee policy and data. I know that our audience includes a range of individuals, right? It includes people who may not work in this area. It also includes experts in this area. But I hope to sort of provide some context that will guide our conversation throughout the day today. So to do that, and thinking about what information would be most useful, I put together some thinking about where are we at right now, right? And so Jim mentioned that the Welcome Corps is sort of a new initiative that is, right, very much in the cutting edge, right? It's something that is happening now. But I wanted to sort of take a look at, well, what has refugee resettlement typically looked like in the United States? And so I won't be talking about the Welcome Corps, right? We'll hear from them themselves and from the State Department later in the day, but to sort of provide an overview of what does refugee resettlement look like? And so to do that, I think it's necessary to start with thinking about the global context of displacement. I'll overview sort of historically, what do US refugee policies look like? And then think about the actual process of refugee resettlement. What has this looked like historically? What is the process? And sort of what do we know about people who are coming? And throughout that, I'll sort of highlight what I would categorize as three parts of the resettlement process, right? From pre-departure, when people are still in another country and being selected for resettlement, what happens when they arrive, and then what happens sort of longer term, right, in terms of integration. So here is an overview of what the current context of displacement looks like. So this is from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And based on their 2022 report, we know that there are about 180.4 million people who are forcibly displaced worldwide, right? So this includes a much smaller number where we have here, right, about 35.3 million refugees. But they also include, right, in their total number, 62.5 million internally displaced people, right? So those are people who have not actually left their country. They have not crossed any international borders, but they are no longer where they used to live within their country borders. Refugees, by contrast, are people who have crossed national borders and, right, are recognized by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees as people who would be, they would be able to be resettled. And so usually when people make their path to the United States, that's through the process of resettlement, which the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees sort of oversees. Included in that are not Palestinian refugees who are included under a different mandate. They're not counted in that. They're counted in the 35.3, but about 29.4 million refugees are within the UNHCR mandate. Right, we can also think this total number also includes 5.4 million asylum seekers and 5.2 million other people who are in need of international protection. Right, and so I want to just step back and think about two terms in particular. I've already given you a number of terms, but I think these are the most important to very clearly differentiate for the United States context. So we can think about a refugee, and these are the definitions used broadly, right? A refugee is a person residing outside of his or her country of nationality who is unable or unwilling to return because of, quote, a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Asylum seekers, in contrast, are people who move across international borders in search of protection, but whose claim for refugee status has not yet been decided, right? And so when we think about people who are crossing the southern border of the United States, for example, those are people who are coming to the United States to seek asylum, right? They're not refugees under the United Nations mandate, but right, once they come, they are given a process by which they can see if they are eligible for asylum status or not. However, right, in the media or sort of social use, oftentimes the terms are used interchangeably. So I want to differentiate that from a sort of legal policy standpoint, they are two very distinct groups. So what did things look like in 2022? In 2022, 52% of all refugees and other people in need of international protection came from just 3 countries, right? Syria, Ukraine, and Afghanistan. Children account for 30% of the world's population, but they account for 40% of all forcibly displaced people, right? So there's a large number of women and children in particular who are included in this group. 70% of refugees and other people in need of international protection lived in countries neighboring their countries of origin, right? So when we think about refugees, most refugees are not traveling far, right? They're traveling to border countries. What this means at the same time is that oftentimes the countries bordering countries in conflict are themselves, right, countries in the global south or countries with limited economic development. And so they, as countries, are also facing difficulties in meeting the needs of their own populations, right? So oftentimes refugee flows introduce sort of a burden, right, onto these countries. So to give examples, Turkey hosts the largest number of refugees in 2022, 3.6 million. The Islamic Republic of Iran hosts 3.4 million refugees. Colombia hosts 2.5 million refugees. Germany, which is perhaps the exception to this group, right, hosts 2.1 million refugees, and Pakistan hosts 1.7 million refugees, right? So you can think about where conflict is happening globally and that people aren't actually overall traveling very far. And finally, right, today we're talking about the process of refugee resettlement. But in reality, most refugees are not resettled. They are not given the opportunity to come to the United States or to Canada or to Germany or to another European country, right? Most refugees are sort of stuck in these countries where they've crossed borders. They stay in Turkey, they stay in Iran, they stay in Colombia or Pakistan. So, right, to know that the group that we are talking about is a very small and select group that has been fortunate enough to be resettled in the United States. So now I'd like to shift back to thinking about, well, what does refugee resettlement look like in the United States? And typically we would turn to 1980 as sort of the beginning of the story. I'd like to actually go back a little bit further because I think there's some additional context there. Right, so sort of the main law that still governs our immigration policy, because there has not been any reform since there's been some minor reform, but right, the main immigration policy that still is in effect is from the 1965 amendments to the Immigration and Nationality Act. And I argue that this sort of Nationality Act matters in many ways because it created a permanent admissions category for asylees and refugees, right? So already they were starting to think about refugees and asylum seekers. And the refugee definition that they included in this Nationality Act reflected the 1951 United Nations Geneva Convention, right? So we see sort of globally, there was a move to think more about refugees following the end of the Second World War. In 1968, the US acceded to the 1967 United Nations Protocol relating to the status of refugees. And so in doing so, they also moved to accept the United Nations non-ideological definition of who a refugee is, right? So it wasn't just about ideology that people could seek refuge, it could also be other things, right? So they used that broader definition I highlighted earlier, right? And by doing so, it adopted a more expansive protection for refugees. And at the same time, it also brought up some interesting cases with some Haitian arrivals who were arriving around this time. So in 1973, for example, there were many Haitians coming to the United States, and they actually used the UN protocol as a basis for a class action suit that was rejected, right? So the court decided, no, right, the UN protocol doesn't apply to you. However, in 1980, in the case of Haitian Refugee Center versus Civiletti, the judge actually cited Article 3 of the UN protocol, requiring that application of that protocol be used without discrimination as to race, religion, or country of origin, right? So we really see that there was sort of a shift at that point towards thinking more broadly about the UN protocol, right? And then that brings us to the more typical start of the 1980 Refugee Act, right? And so this is really when you think about refugee policy in the United States, people think about the 1980 Refugee Act. And so this superseded the 1965 Hart-Celler Amendments that I highlighted earlier. It provided funding for the Office of U.S. Coordinator for Refugee Affairs, and it funded the Office of Refugee Resettlement. It also allowed the president to annually establish a refugee ceiling in consultation with Congress. This is what that refugee ceiling or refugee admissions cap has looked like over time, right? So you'll see 1980 over here, and that there's been a lot of change over time, right? You can see in 2020, we sort of reached an overall drop, which was sort of an exception due to COVID. But you can see overall pretty steadily here, it's been around 75,000 refugees has been the cap, right? So this is a cap, it's a ceiling. It's sort of the aspiration. And you can see, right, it has gone up again since the Biden administration. What has actually happened is this, right? So in yellow, you'll see the actual number of refugees who have been admitted over time. And right, again, this is showing fiscal years. And I think the cap for the coming 2024 cap should be announced next week. It hasn't been announced yet that I know of. And so we'll see, right, what happens to that green line sort of for 2024. But what you see is that in reality, right, we did a pretty good job of being really close to our cap until around 2000, right? Then, of course, the September 11th attacks happened, and that changed a lot of immigration flows into the United States, right? And so you can see there's, right, we're very much under the cap here. And then again, right, you see here, although the Biden administration has raised the cap very highly, we haven't actually filled that cap, right? And so it's important to think about what is the cap and what is actually happening on the ground. I think the refugee admissions overall in the last couple of months have really increased, and so I think there's been some difficulties sort of on the ground to get people in, especially after numbers were so low after COVID, right? And so that also meant that there were cuts in staffing at many places who are resettling refugees. So now I'd like to shift gears a little bit to think about, well, what does the refugee resettlement process look like? So I have broken it down into sort of 3 overall stages that I will highlight briefly here, and then we'll sort of delve into each of them. Right, so pre-departure is when people are in another country, say Turkey, for example, and there they might go to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and register themselves as a refugee. When they do that, right, people on the grounds are sort of looking at, well, does this person need resettlement, right? And so oftentimes people who are given priority for resettlement might be people who need medical care that they can't get in the country where they are. And so they're sort of pre-screened by the resettlement support center staff. They go through an on-site interview and a very in-depth security clearance and fingerprinting, right? So refugees who are coming through resettlement programs are some of the best vetted people entering our country overall. So I think that's a very important thing to highlight, right? These people probably have gone through security clearance levels equal to people who are working at the government themselves. So they're very highly vetted. Once they arrive, right, so they're sort of allocated into different placements through 9 to 10 voluntary agencies, which I'll talk more about. And they go through a cultural orientation and departure processing before they leave. When they arrive, they are welcomed generally by volunteers from different organizations, including voluntary agencies. And this is very important. They are given sort of financial support for up to 90 days, right? So imagine yourself arriving in a new country, fleeing war, and being given 3 months, up to 3 months of support, right? And so I think this is one of the things that often surprises people when learning about refugee resettlement, right? That 90 days is not very long. Right, and then they are given additional case and medical assistance, but the way that the US refugee resettlement process currently is set up is that, right, there's an expectation that people become self-sufficient, and those are the official words, right, they become self-sufficient by the end of those 90 days. But at the same time, right, there are a number of social services, religious organizations who continue to provide employment services, English language training, medical screening, and also recertification, which I think is of great importance to those who are here today, because thinking about apprenticeships is sort of, right, that recertification and education component. It's also notable that there's a lot of cross-departmental collaboration from the government side, right? So the pre-departure is very much something that Department of Homeland Security takes on. The arrival process is something that the Department of State sort of heads up. And then the integration piece is very much the Department of Health and Human Services, right? So there's a lot of cross-governmental collaboration. Right, so pre-departure, right, we have the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration of the State Department is responsible for identifying refugees for resettlement with the help of UNHCR and managing this sort of process of resettlement overseas. The resettlement support centers gather documents, conduct interviews, and prepare refugee files so that the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration can consider and process cases. And the US Citizenship and Immigration Services is responsible for screening refugees to determine if they qualify for admission and to ensure that they do not present a security risk. I apologize. I spoke before my notes. So where are people coming from? And this is at a regional level, right? Where are people coming from? Where have they come from in the last 10 fiscal years, right? So I haven't included fiscal year 2023 because it ends next week, but we've included, right, 2012 to 2022. So you can see, right, in yellow, there were a lot of people, apologies. There were people coming from Near East and South Asia up through 2017. But we see sort of consistently about an equal number of folks coming from Africa and also from East Asia, right, in the 2012 to 2017 time, right? What you will notice in the 2018 to 2022 data is a growing sort of shade of orange here, that there are more people coming from Europe and Central Asia as refugees. To get into more of the specifics, so here I wanted to show the top 5 countries of origin in each year from 2012 to 2022. And so what you can see is that in 2012, right, we have Iraq in yellow and Burma in orange, sort of as the biggest places, as well as Bhutan. And that sort of goes through, we can see Iraq and Burma sort of as a consistent majority from 2012 to 2015. From 2016 to 2022, more recently, right, the Democratic Republic of Congo in green makes up a pretty good representation of the top 5 countries. Syria we see in red down here, right, which makes sense based on when the conflict in Syria began. And here, right, we see even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right, we see that there is already some people coming from Ukraine, right, that became within the top 3 countries, right? And for most of these fiscal years, actually these top 3 countries made up 50% or more of the overall refugees resettled, right? So that sort of shows the extent to which that group is represented. To provide it a little bit differently, right? So this is the fiscal year 2022 resettlement. And so this just shows you sort of from a global perspective, where are people actually coming from, right? So we have here, we have the United States resettled 25,465 refugees in fiscal year 2022. 31% came from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 7% came from Sudan, 18% came from Syria, 2% from Iraq, 6% from Afghanistan, 8% from Burma, 2% from Moldova, and 6% from Ukraine. And then we also have over here in Latin America, 4% from Guatemala and 2% from El Salvador. So what happens once people arrive? So the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration of the State Department is responsible for providing support for refugees for up to 90 days after their arrival in the United States. The Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is housed within the Department of Health and Human Services, is responsible for providing resettled refugees with longer-term cash and medical assistance and language and social services. And sort of the main on-the-ground actors that refugees are interacting with sort of on a daily basis are individuals who work at voluntary agencies, or VOLAGs, which are now 10, was recently 9, US non-governmental organizations who are responsible for resettling refugees in communities in the United States. They have over 350 affiliated offices across the country, right? And so I wanted to name some of these because you probably have heard some of these names as well, right? So some of the voluntary agencies include Church World Service, HIAS, International Rescue Committee, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, World Relief, ECDC, Episcopal Migration Ministries, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and Bethany Christian Services was recently added as an additional 10th voluntary agency. right? And so one of the things that I think is important and why I want to highlight those names is because while most of these organizations are now secular, their names really reflect that their religious origins or motivations, right? So HIAS, for example, began to resettle Jewish refugees to the United States, and they've now broadened their scope to reflect the changing displacement happening around the globe. And I think that's always sort of a way that the United States has also worked, right? We have the governmental support, but we also rely on, right, people sort of on the grounds to take on and to really welcome people to the United States. We can think about this as well in the role of faith-based communities, in immigrant protections and advocacy, right? Even historically, right? Things like the sanctuary movement. We've seen a really strong role of religious organizations throughout. So where did these people go to live? So from 2012 to 2022, they went all across the United States, although there not too many refugees resettled in Wyoming, as we recently learned. But right, so the US has resettled in the last 11 years, just over 500,000 refugees, right? So think back to that global context of displacement, where we had about 25 million people who are currently displaced around the globe, right? The US actually is the country that resettles most refugees, but still in 11 years, it's been 500,000, right? So it's not really that high when we think about it in a global scope. 10% of refugees have gone to Texas, 9% have gone to California, 6% have gone over to New York, 5% to Michigan, and 4% to Ohio, right? So those are sort of the places where refugees have been resettled at the highest end, but you can see it's happening across the United States. All right, so what happens sort of after that initial arrival, right? The first 3 months, people get settled, they get their kids enrolled in school, and what happens beyond that, right? So they're sort of attending English language courses, getting set up with social and medical support, receiving employment counseling, but right after that 90 days of financial support ends, they're really expected to be self-sufficient. And usually that means paying the rent, right? That's usually the main thing that people are focused on, because refugees are eligible for a number of other supports, such as SNAP, Medicaid, right? But the rent is often sort of the difficult factor. They also must repay the cost of their resettlement flight, and so this also is something that I think comes as a surprise to many people who are new to learning about refugee resettlement. And I've heard mixed things about this. I've heard from refugees themselves that they didn't know this, although I've also been told, right, that they were clearly told this before they flew. I've also heard that it's a really great way for them to sort of set up credit once they arrive, right? And so you can think you're new in a country, your credit history from abroad no longer matters. But so what they do is they repay the cost of their resettlement flight at a no interest loan rate. But so they're paying, maybe $20 per person in your family every month. And so that's a very low amount, but for someone who may be struggling financially, it's quite a significant amount. But at the same time, it allows them to establish credit. So this is something that I think surprises many people from the public, also among refugees themselves. Right, and so refugees are then eligible to apply for legal permanent residence status, or green cards, 1 year after they arrive. However, that is retroactive. So most people, when you get lawful permanent residence, you get it right from the date you get your card in hand. But refugees, actually, they get it sort of retroactively, and that means that they're eligible for citizenship 5 years after admissions. They, are expected to go through the English language requirements of citizenship and the civics test as well. Although I also know that there are cases where, due to trauma, people actually are able to sort of circumvent some of those tests and still become citizens because they can't really learn English because they've experienced too much trauma. I also want to highlight some data, right? So what do we sort of know about how refugees transition? We don't actually know very much. So one source of data that we do have is the annual survey of refugees, which has typically been conducted by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. I think it's now, the Urban Institute is now also involved in conducting the survey. But what they do is they sample 1,500 refugee households each year. that were resettled in the preceding 5 fiscal years, right? So these numbers are giving you sort of someone from year 1 of resettlement, someone from year 5 of resettlement, but it doesn't follow the same people over time, right? So it's not a longitudinal study. We don't really have a good sense of, right, how someone progresses through once they've been resettled. Of course, there's other academic work that demonstrates things like that, but sort of at a national level, we don't have a really good sense, right? So these are just some highlights I wanted to present, right? So about 22% of households are still receiving public cash assistance within 5 years. I think this number is particularly striking, right? 88% of those surveyed were employed in the labor force, right? And so that's a really high rate. Like, people are working, right? They're being self-sufficient. 77% are full-time employees. Sort of on average, they earn about $13 an hour, and this is 2019, so I would hope that that has gone up. Only 13% get medical coverage through the respondent or the family member's employer. And I think this is also something that is often very difficult for refugees. Oftentimes their children are eligible for public health insurance, but the adults are not. And oftentimes, because they've flown conflict and have been displaced, there are often a number of really significant medical needs and dental needs, actually, that they don't necessarily have insurance to pay for. And about 50% would rate their English proficiency well or very well at the time the survey was taken. So at that point, I would like to actually open us up to some questions. So if there are questions, I would be happy to take them at this point. There are 2 people with mics who will be here in the room, so if you have a question you'd like to ask, you can go ahead and raise your hand.
I will ask a question.
Someone else is already.
You talked on. Okay, I'll speak loudly. You mentioned the 3 stages. About how much time on average do people spend in each of the 3 stages? And I know there's going to be variation, and sort of what is the cause of the variation at different stages in the process?
That's a great question, right? So the arrival period, well, I'll start at the beginning, right? Sort of the pre-departure can last many years. It sort of depends on the country of origin, the conflict where people are hosted. But if we think about refugees who are displaced globally, right, refugee camps often become places where people die and people are born, right? People are born into refugee status. And so there are cases where refugee resettlement doesn't happen, right? So sort of the maximum. The folks that I've spoken with have had faster processes because they've arrived here in the United States. But I think in cases in particular where there's medical needs, particularly for children, that is sort of expedited, right? They're sort of moved to the top of the pile and given priority. And so then still the overall process before they come can take months to years, right? And then the resettlement process, once they're here, right, they're really given that 90 days of financial assistance, so that's a very short time period. However, the voluntary agencies who are providing that financial assistance through contracts with the government, right, they don't go away, right? If someone comes to their door and asks for additional assistance, they'll provide that assistance or redirect them to a local mosque that might be able to help them pay their rent, or to another organization that might be able to provide English support. So I think that, right, the borders sort of blur about when voluntary agencies work really ends, because you form relationships with people. Oftentimes those voluntary agencies also offer legal support. And so when someone comes to apply for their lawful permanent residence or their green card a year later, right, they have another touch point with that initial resettlement organization, and oftentimes again when they apply for citizenship, right? So there is some, I would say, administrative data there about how people fare over 5 years. And the integration process, right, it depends how you measure integration. We can see sort of here the 5-year landing point, which I would say is a pretty good sign of integration, especially in the sort of employment, labor market participation. English is okay, I would say 50%, right? But things of like, are their needs being fully met? I think there's still room within that 5-year period that there's additional need for support, whether through employment or education, or through other means such as sponsorship. Yes.
So I saw you had an 88% statistic of folks that are in the workforce, I guess, after 5 years or within the 5 years. I'm curious how active a role the private sector plays in refugee resettlement. I mean, what we do, we're starting to see more and more companies sign on to the 10th commitment of refugee resettlement and working with Welcome.us and other organizations. And I'm just curious from your perspective how you see that evolving.
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So I think within the last 5-10 years, there's been sort of more of a focus on getting companies to sort of seek out and provide training opportunities to get refugees employed. And I think that's really great. I think it sort of is more of a localized effort so far, right? Like, for example, right, we know Chobani makes great yogurt, also a Kurdish immigrant to the United States. And so, right, like, they have committed to hiring refugees, right? And so we see sort of select companies, but if you're resettled in a spot in the United States where there's not a company doing that, oftentimes what happens is people are taking the first job that they're offered, and that's sort of what they're encouraged to do because they need to be able to pay their rent, right, in month 4. And so there's a lot of sort of underemployment, I would argue, a lot of people, right, becoming dishwashers even though they were a barber in Syria, because that's the first job that they're offered. And so then sometimes that sort of leads to a longer term trajectory where people don't have the opportunity to move up or to sort of take a chance by moving into a private company, or even to the opportunity that they had been, or the job they had been doing in the past, right? They don't have the time to get that training, or the language skills is also a big sort of hurdle for people to making that shift.
Hi, Michelle. I wanted to ask, because I'm not fully versed on resettlement in the US, but I know in parts of Europe when refugees were resettled, they're kind of sent to more remote areas where there isn't much of a diaspora. What is it now? I know kind of in the 70s, like Dearborn, a lot of people they weren't refugees, they migrated to Dearborn or California, certain parts of the states. Now, is there any statistics or data on where refugees have been in the past few years resettled, and how is that selected in the United States?
That's a great question as well. So I think sort of and if anyone can correct me in the room, please feel free to do so. Right, but this sort of map of refugee resettlement is based off of 2 things. It's based off of state population, right? So there is a little bit of, right, like, it's not a surprise that Texas, California, and New York are taking more refugees, right? They have a bigger population. At the same time, there's also a sort of policy currently where, right, these voluntary agencies who are being contracted by the government, they're the main actors on the ground, making sure that people get what they need when they first arrive. And so people are resettled in areas where those voluntary agencies are located, right? And so what that means is that there are actually places where refugees aren't resettled, like Wyoming, because there's no voluntary agency there, right? And so there's no one to provide those on-the-ground services. So I think that's also something that, right, is sort of an innovation of the Welcome Corps, is that by having private sponsorship of refugees, you can have a group of people in Wyoming decide they want to resettle and support a refugee, and that's going to sort of change the demographics of the United States more broadly. Sort of at the more micro level, I think something that's important to point out is, right, because rent is something that is sort of a hurdle, sometimes it's easier to resettle people in places where it's a little bit less expensive to live, but usually the voluntary agencies are in cities or urban areas. But that means that even within that city, right, oftentimes refugees are housed in places where, right, students might be living, or right, it's sort of the cheapest rent in the area. And so at a smaller level, oftentimes there is sort of a diaspora group there already, because they're sort of housed in different places. So in the context of the Chapel Hill, Durham, Raleigh area, North Carolina, where I've done some research, right, we know that, right, people are being housed in the same places where our students are living. But there's also sort of a pattern, right? So the voluntary agencies would go out to 5 apartment complexes where they have standing relations, and they would get people apartments when they arrived. And so there's sort of a pattern that then you have a lot of Syrians living in place 1 or 2 within a certain geographic area. So there is sort of that resettlement pattern does currently sort of foster some diaspora group as well.
I can just also add on that when refugees are processed overseas, they're asked if they have a U.S. tie, a friend or a relative with whom they wish to resettle, and just in recognition that, you know, successful integration, you know, so much of it depends upon community and who you know. You know, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program endeavors as much as possible to resettle that refugee in the same community as their U.S. tie, and about 75% of cases processed have U.S. ties. So refugees can't necessarily choose where they go, but if they have a U.S. tie, the program makes every effort to reunite them.
From the processing standpoint also, when a case is allocated at the allocations meetings every week, the national agencies review the bios once they're received. If a case does not have a U.S. tie, it's considered what we call a free case. If it's a free case, we look at the bios to determine where the best placement will be for this particular case. We look at where they're coming from. Where do we have a population that they'll be able to integrate quickly? What kind of medical needs do they have? Do we need to place them near a hospital where we know that they specialize in a certain type of care? What does the public benefits look like? So there's a whole lot. It's not just, you know, U.S. tie, or we're going to place you here because this looks like the best place, or, well, we're just going to place you here because we need more people here, but it's where are you going to thrive? That is the goal of the national agencies when they place cases throughout the country. Where is this family going to thrive the best?
So it looks like we have some questions online that we're going to turn to as well.
While we're doing that, I'll just add, you know, to see the sort of personal touch that goes into that, I think surprises a lot of people. You know, that we're just not sort of shipped off. There is some real attention paid to trying to think about those.
And that's the goal of the resettlement program, right?
It's like maybe
That's the goal of the resettlement program, is to make sure that, you know, we're bringing and welcoming people into our communities, and they need to be thriving members of our communities. So it's not, like I said, it's not just about throwing them where you think, you know, we need more people here. Yes, sometimes that happens with free cases, but generally we look at every single bio when we're processing the cases at the national level to determine where the best placement will be for them. So there is a lot of care. We have a lot of at the national level, there's a lot of cross communication between different departments. So between PRM, the national agency, the local resettlement agency taking the case, the state refugee coordinator, the state refugee health coordinator, everybody that for particularly harder cases or cases that have more challenges, it's best to work as a team. So there is a lot of involvement all the way around for people when we resettle them.
Great, thank you. Eamon, we'll turn to some online questions.
Yes, so our first online question is there any data on refugee housing? For example, something like American Housing Survey. Is there any such data on where the refugees are housed, what type of housing, multifamily versus single family, density, etc.? Especially given housing availability and affordability being an issue at the current moment.
That's a great question. To my knowledge, there's not any data on that per se. I would say generally, it also again depends on context. But I also know that many people, right, sort of move to sort of collectively work towards home ownership, right? So there is sort of over time, there's a trajectory towards homeownership as well. But I see you also have something to add, so
Sorry,
I'll
you might hear
hand over
from
the
me a
microphone.
lot.
No, thank you.
I've worked at all different levels, so with housing, there is not right now currently, but local agencies are recognizing that this is a nationwide problem across the board for everybody. It's not just a refugee problem, it's a poor person's problem. So it is, it is being introduced to study to find out what can be done and how we can support refugees. I'm a director of a resettlement office in Fairfax, right down the road. And housing here, as you know, is ridiculous. And Salima and I are resettling families that are families of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 in Northern Virginia. So it's a problem. It's a well-known problem with resettlement, and it is something that locally resettlement agencies are working on, probably also at the national level as well. I know that there's just a lot of innovation working to try to figure that issue out.
Thank you. Yeah, Eamon, go ahead. We have more online questions.
Yes, our second question is, could you discuss the demographics of refugees in terms of usual ages and gender? And are there refugees fleeing gender-based violence and refugees who are LGBTQ?
Those are also great questions, right? I'll again provide an overview, but open it to others in the room as well. So my understanding is that yes, there are people who are fleeing gender-based violence. There are people who are LGBTQ+. Those are people who oftentimes are given priority for resettlement because they're often not safe in the country that they are in, right? So we can think about that list I had mentioned earlier, right? Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, right? Those are places where, right, being LGBTQ plus is not really readily accepted, right? So those would be cases that would be pushed to the top. In terms of gender, I would say there's, right, a lot of families being resettled. There's a lot of men being resettled through the Special Immigrant Visa Program, which is a little bit different of a policy, a pathway, but that often includes people who have worked for the US government as translators or in other roles. And so they're also sort of in the mix. But otherwise, it's a lot of families, a lot of women and children, right? Big families with a lot of children oftentimes as well. We have time for one final question if anyone has a question they'd like to ask.
Mine's kind of a follow-up after your response because, again, I'm not too familiar when it comes to US resettlement. It sounds like there's a lot of thought and consideration, even though it might be more difficult and tedious to come to the US. So is there any reports comparing when it comes to reunification or family separation? Because in Europe, a lot of families someone will be put in Sweden, and no matter how close they are, the ties, the other one will be put in Germany. So is there any comparison to why it's different, or kind of, maybe I'm doing like a more bird's eye view and big picture, but yeah, it was interesting to hear that. So I'm not sure if you know of any comparison when it comes to reunifications, separations. Yeah.
I think that would be a Colleen question. I'm not sure if there's any reporting behind that.
Yeah, because my initial question was more US based, because I was curious about where they're placed. Often other places they're just thrown somewhere remote where it's very hard to integrate. And sometimes I think or just very remote areas. Here, sounds like there's a lot more thought, care, and consideration. So I'm curious about the comparison and why it's different. It's more tedious and difficult to come to the US, but why is it a little bit, why is it more thoughtful processes or comparison to resettlement across the board, like you said, different countries in the West, Europe versus the US?
Yeah, and it's a good question. I'm not super familiar with how cases are resettled in Europe, and it sounds more that they're just trying to increase, the pipe. The thing is, when an individual's resettled in the US, they can pick up and move, they can out-migrate. And so the purpose of the program too is to try to prevent out-migration, and to successfully integrate them into communities. And if they're just resettled in a really remote community where, they can't speak the same language as their neighbors, they're not going to successfully integrate. And the whole purpose of the program is successful integration. So hence all the care involved and, you know, the really thoughtful approach to placement and resettlement.
So we have just about 1 minute left. So if it's a short question, we can go ahead and,
This is really more of a comment that Europe is a bunch of different national countries, states, that make state policy. US is one big, gigantic republic of 50 states that we can make a national policy and at the national level look at where do we need to place people. Whereas in Europe, you know, maybe Sweden can take more people that year, but Germany can't. And even though your family lives in Germany, we're going to send you to Sweden.
all right, so I'm,
Sorry, I just
Going-
want to add, also, you know, people can, if you're going to be resettled faster in Europe, then you're going to want to go to Europe. So it also depends on the processing timeframes. It takes a long time to come to the United States with all of the vetting. I don't know what the vetting overseas looks like. I'm sure it's similar, but a lot of people go to a European country first because it's closer and it's faster to get into for safety reasons.
great. So this has been a great question and discussion session. So we'll now take a 15-minute break to foster more discussion.